Welcome back to another special Saturday edition of Daily Dose of Septuagint. And we're excited to be back in my alma mater, Cambridge. Found this lovely old picture of the town from the late 1800s to early 1900s. Still kind of looks the same, actually, which is pretty interesting, other than the horse-drawn carriages. They still have the market around the corner from King's College Chapel. But we're going to be back in the larger Cambridge Septuagint, this critical edition of the Old Testament in Greek that was published by Cambridge University Press over a fairly lengthy time period, edited by Brooke, McLean, and Thackeray. In the prior video, I introduced the different volumes of this edition, starting from the Pentateuch, running through the later historical books. You can see it ran for about 3.5, 4 decades. And if you recall, the text that they display as the text is not necessarily a reconstruction of the Old Greek. It is largely from Codex Vaticanus, the Suite edition, with some modifications. It's mostly focused on the critical apparatus based on the uncials, as they called them, the minuscules, and a bunch of other later versions, church fathers, and that kind of thing. And so I want to get back into it for one more video for now at least, and we're going to focus in on the volume dealing with 1st and 2nd Samuel, also known as 1st and 2nd Kingdoms in the Greek form, and just do a couple little case studies from that. Before we do so, though, I peeked back at the preface, and I thought it was pretty interesting. Some of the things they mention in the introductory notes to this particular book. First off, they talk about the prior publication in 1917, so that's an important date. And they basically say that essentially they will do a lot of work in preparing this volume, but the preliminary work for the second volume, that is this one that we're going to look at, was seriously delayed due to the war, the First World War, of course. And so they said in that time period, they couldn't do much. Obviously, England was involved in World War I. So it's kind of an interesting little reminder of the historical contingencies that impact scholarship, not only in the modern day, but especially in the past. You'll often see this where whether it's the Dead Sea Scrolls or even earlier editions of various things, they get put on hold because of various geopolitical events. You know, a whole stretch of scholarship was put on hold, not only for World War I, but especially for World War II. So I thought that was pretty interesting. They talk about how one of the editors got a promotion, and so he couldn't really do it anymore. And so Thackeray had a sort of bigger role to play, but then he ends up dying over the course of this. And then I thought this was kind of interesting because I did not know this until I read this preface, that at least in 1st and 2nd Samuel, the work of collecting the manuscript evidence has been materially lightened by the generous help of Professor Alfred Ross in Göttingen. And so there is an intersection between Göttingen and Cambridge here. We've talked about the Göttingen edition and Rolf's efforts on his own minor edition and then his major edition of the Psalms, as well as the whole project by the Septuaginta Unternehmen that began really under his leadership and has continued to this day. And so I find it really interesting that even as the World War was playing out between the Allies and the Central Powers, Germany on one side, England on the other, from a scholarly perspective, you have some at least some help across the sea, if you will, between the guys at Cambridge and Rolfs in Göttingen. He allowed him to look at collations and images. They had terms between the university press and himself, so you have this cross pollination, this collaboration, if you will, and they even use his basically his catalog of Greek manuscripts on the Old Testament side to give them their labels and their numbers. And so you start to see from this volume onward a greater consistency in the sigla that are used for the various, or the labels that are used for various manuscripts between what they're doing at the Cambridge edition and what he's doing on his end. So it starts to become a bit more uniform, whereas prior to this, there's some weirdness where they don't always match and that kind of thing. So I just thought that was pretty interesting in terms of the historical background of this particular effort and the intersection there with the German effort as well. Well, let's take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 2, or as you can see here, Basileon Alpha, therefore 1 Kings. And we're going to take a look at Hannah's song. I covered her song somewhat briefly, just a couple little lines from it in my videos on Codex Alexandrinus, but let's look at it in a bit more detail, starting here with how it looks in the larger Cambridge edition. So you'll see at the top you have Basileon Alpha, that's 1 Kingdoms. You'll see that we are in chapter 2 here in the margin. And remember, the verses run down the left-hand side, but they're also embedded in the text themselves. And then if, in this particular case, because it's poetry, you'll see they structure it that way visibly as well. Down here you see an excerpt of the apparatus, and it is a lot of information, and this is just for verse 1. So you'll see this is chapter 2, verse 1, so it's corresponding just to this information here, and a whole bunch of other stuff thrown in there in terms of the variants and that kind of stuff. So let's take a look at it, and just to remind ourselves, you have the right side square bracket that introduces the lemma followed by the variance, or here followed by the variance, and so on. Vertical bar separating variant units, if you will. So you have the one for apin, then you have asteriothe, etc. You'll typically have colons separating different options or different readings for a given variant and so forth. So I covered that last time in the prior video. But let's take a look at a few pieces here in the apparatus. What you'll notice for verse 1 is that they say CF or compare with Luke 1:46 and following. That's what that's getting at. The abbreviation for Luke there is sort of Latinized, if you will. And it's megalune, hesuche, mu, ton kurion, etc., etc. So this is from the Magnificat, as you may know. And virtually every Lucan scholar would agree that even though the Magnificat of Mary in Luke 1 doesn't necessarily cite in a verbatim way Hannah's song here, or even lots of other Old Testament passages that are behind the scenes, if you will, there's a clear conceptual framework that Hannah's song does indeed provide for the Magnificat. And, we have the asteriothe, he cardia mu, so my heart is strengthened in kurio, whereas in the Lord, whereas the Magnificat says, my soul magnifies the Lord. You've got soteri mu, my Savior here in the Magnificat, whereas you have in soteria su, in your salvation. So it's more evocative, it's more like echoes and allusions, but there's a clear sense in which Hannah's song, whereby she is praising God for supernaturally intervening and overturning her barrenness, providing her with a son, and so forth, is a framework that is in a sense reused by Mary to respond to a similar kind of divine intervention in the virgin conception of Jesus. So it's interesting that they're offering this not so much as text critically significant, but just as conceptually parallel and that kind of thing. So that's helpful, like a little footnote that you might see in your English Bible. But let's take a look at some of the actual text critical evidence here. And we begin with the first chi, with that little closed bracket. That's referring to this one here. And you'll see that it is preceded, so that's what the PR means, by ke euxita ana, or by ke prosyuxita ana, or even kai proxuxita to kurio. All of these are situations where one of these three options is preceding, it shows up before this initial chi. In other words, the Old Greek, or at least Vaticanus, has just and she said, but three other options show up in a whole boatload of manuscripts, including these, plus Alexandrinus and a bunch of others, plus a few more, have something to the effect of, and Anna prayed, or she prayed to the Lord, or something to that effect. Let's first take a look at Alexandrinus, because you'll see it right here. It's the chief witness for this added bit, if you will, that's not in Vaticanus. Remember, Vaticanus is the main text here. That's why the B is in that top margin. And let's just glimpse at it, what it looks like here. So if you look at Codex Alexandrinus, at this verse, you will see precisely what the text, the apparatus in the larger Cambridge says. So you start with this chi right here. That's our chi. Then you have a P that's partly a little bit missing there, but the rho, the omicron, sigma, eta, upsilon, C here, the alpha, T plus O, and then so prosyuxita, so there's that word here. And then you see the ana or Hannah, and then we have chi apin, it picks up there. So this is a good example of what the apparatus is trying to tell us. If you go look it up, here is that prefatory chi prosyuxita ana that you see right here in the apparatus, and presumably these others would look similar. Now, you may be wondering, why is that? Why are they adding and Anna prayed? Well, the Hebrew tradition, as has been passed down to us in the Masoretic text, does actually start with, and Hannah prayed and said. And so it appears to me that even though whatever Vaticanus, this translator or whoever is preceding Vaticanus, whatever they had in front of them maybe lacked that, but it's a very strong tradition that you have and Hannah prayed It's codified in the Masoretic text, but a bunch of other manuscripts attest that it probably was there in the Hebrew tradition of the original translator, and somehow Vaticanus has dropped that out. So pretty interesting little situation. They even have some of them added just after the apon, maybe as a way to conflate the two readings. Let's move on a little bit. If you look this up in the Hebrew, you'll see it says something like, "My heart rejoices in the Lord." But here in the Vaticanus text, we have esteriothe, which is basically to be made strong or to be strengthened. And so there's an interesting variant there as well. So you see the esteriothe, so that's what it's referring to. And according to the editors, Origen, at least in the Latin form, he attests to exultavit. And so that would be to rejoice. So that is a bit closer to the known Hebrew, "my heart rejoices." And so maybe Origen's aware of that through his work on the hexapla. He's aware, hey, wait a second, the Hebrew says this, and it's come to us in the Latin form. A couple other things you might say, okay, well, hupsothe is preceded by and in some traditions, so there is a and a chi here in some of it. Let's see what other interesting things. Oh, let's point out this, my enemies. And so if we look at the eplatunthe, actually we're going to get to this one in a minute. You've got the epi plus the stoma. And so let's take a look at what's going on there. So we have eplatunthe, which means to make wide. Then we have the epi, ekthrus ta stoma mu, and there's that stoma plus the mu at the end. In other words, what the apparatus is doing with this listing is it's referring to everything between the epi plus the stoma. It's just getting rid of the ekthros, just to kind of compress the space, if you will. So what's going on with that? In other words, the idea is, my mouth is widened upon my enemies. So that's what Vaticanus says. But they say in the apparatus that its stoma comes first, or tostoma in Alexandrinus, and then the mu, then the ep, then the ekthrus. So in other words, it is in essence, it is transposed. And again, they list Alexandrinus as the key witness to that. So let's take a look at Alexandrinus just to prove that out. And so you'll see the eplatunthe. So that's not too bad. You see that right here. And then you do have the ta stoma, just like the apparatus says, ta stoma. And then the mu here, there's your mu, then ep, ekthrus, mu. So ep, ekthrus, they don't need to add the mu because that's in the last position and everything. So just again, another way to get a feel for how you can track the apparatus information and see what it looks like in a manuscript. Well, let's jump down now to the end of Hannah's song here and look specifically at verse 10. And so we begin with the Kyrios asthene poiese antidikon autou. So the Lord has made weak his opponents. And then Kyrios hagios, the Lord is holy. Now here's something that's quite interesting about this. That line, the Lord weakens or somehow opposes those who are his enemies and so forth, that is found in the Masoretic tradition. Fair enough. Then you jump down to what the larger Cambridge Septuagint lists as 10c. That is a third new part of verse 10. And this part largely is in the Masoretic as well. So, Kyrios anebes uranus, the Lord has ascended to heaven, and he ebrontes, he thunders. Autas krine, he will judge the ends of the earth, the akrages kai didosin, he will give strength, iskun, tois basilusin, hemon, he will give strength to our kings, and he will lift high hupsose, the keros Christou autou of his anointed one. That is also found, basically, more or less, in the Hebrew tradition. But here's the rub. This bit is not from Kyrios hagios all the way through to poien krima. He will give judgment, kai dikausunen, and righteousness in meso, in the midst of the earth. From Lord is holy all the way down to the midst of the earth. You do not find that in the Masoretic tradition. And so let's take a look at the first way in which the apparatus handles this. Notice it says 10a and b. So that's A through B. That's the part we're talking about. They tell us, hey, compare this with Jeremiah 9, 22, and 23, where you see basically, with a few minor modifications, the same wording. Me chalchasto hasafas and me chalchasto hafranima. So you do see a slight difference there between the intelligent one and the wise one. Inte Sophia, don't boast in your strength, but boast in knowing the Lord, that kind of thing. So here's the weird situation. This bit, so don't let the wise person boast in his wisdom, or don't let the strong person boast in his strength, but boast in knowing the Lord, etc., because he's going to do judgment to the ends of the earth. That is secure in Jeremiah. It is found in the Hebrew, it's found in the Greek version, and so forth, and we'll get to Greek Jeremiah down the road. And so we're not 100% sure, so far as I'm aware, there's going to be different theories on this, how this stuff got into Greek 1 Samuel. Was it somehow imported in from Jeremiah? Is it similar to that big example we saw for Psalm 14 or /13 in the Greek, where you see a similar kind of addition in the Greek text that appears to be maybe borrowed from Paul or something like that? We don't know. I mean, the jury's kind of still out in terms of how you end up with this longer reading in the Greek form that just so happens to be almost verbatim the same as you'll find in Jeremiah. Now, the reason why this is pretty interesting, other than it's just a very big plus, if you will, a very big addition compared to what you find in the Hebrew tradition, is that something like this shows up in 1 Corinthians 1, where Paul will say, and it's a citation, he says, as it is written, something to that effect, the one who boasts in the Lord, let him boast, which is more or less from verse 10b. But hold that thought, we're going to come back to that. This is why this is sort of attained some attention. It's because Paul appears to be citing from one of these texts, either the Jeremiah text or perhaps this addition, if it is an addition, in the Greek of 1 Samuel. But let's dig a little bit deeper. One of the first things you'll see in the apparatus of the larger Cambridge is this very small note, but it's a very significant note. It says, from Kyrios, second instance. Remember the 1 with a 0 or a 2 plus a 1 or whatever. That means first instance or what have you. So this will be the second instance of Kyrios here. So it's not this one, it's this one. All right, so from that Kyrios all the way to, and then he goes down to 10b, to Gase. So they're referring to this Gase here. In other words, the whole thing between Kyrios Hagios all the way to the midst of the earth, so that's this big addition we're talking about, has what looks to be this division sign and codex M. Now, this division sign is an obelus in the Latin form. It's an OS in the Greek form. Now, what is an obelus? Again, I'm going to do a whole series of videos on the hexapla, but what that is a marking that shows up in the post-Origen tradition, because Origen is going to do all this work to try to compare the Hebrew with the Greek that he had and so forth. And we've seen this in numerous videos already. You have the asterisk, which marks when something is in the Masoretic, or excuse me, not the Masoretic, but the Hebrew tradition that Origen had at his disposal. And so it's not so much the Masoretic, but as it is the Hebrew. But it's in that, but it's not in the LXX. It's not in that. That's what the asterisk means. The obelisk is basically the reverse. It's not in the Hebrew. It's not found there, but it is in the Septuagint. That's what we're talking about with this obelisk. And so this is a perfect marking here that says, hey, look, from here all the way down to here, yes, it's in the Greek. No, it's not apparently in the Hebrew. But let's see what it looks like in the actual manuscript. So what I put on the screen here is Codex M, which is Codex Quislianus. It's found in Paris. It dates to the 7th century. I'll do some videos on it down the road. It's in the National Library of Paris there. And you'll see here is the Kyrios Hagios there. Now the scans online aren't super high res. I'm doing the best I can here, but the Lord is holy, so that's what we see right here. And then you have all those lines about don't boast, etc., all the way down to, if you can make it out, this is that final Gase there that's going to correspond to this one. So you got the Kyrios here and the Gase there. Now what do you notice in the left-hand margin? You can barely make it out, but every single line has that siglum. It has that division marking, that obelisk saying that, hey, these lines are in the Greek, but they are not found in the Hebrew. At least the Hebrew that the scribe of this manuscript in the 7th century had at his disposal, which again is very similar, apparently, at least in the way this is treated, to the Masoretic text as we know it today. So that is significant that the scribes were aware that there was an issue here, and so they are marking it, most likely carrying on the tradition of Origen himself. So if that is original Origen, then his Hebrew text also did not have these lines, pushing it back really to the 3rd century, long before we have the rise of and the solidification of the Masoretic tradition. So this omission, if you can call it that, or the lack of these lines, goes back very, very early, showing that our Masoretic tradition, at least in this point, appears to be quite stable. Now, contrast this with Codex Vaticanus, where you don't have anything. You have the Kyrios Hagios there. You've got the Geis somewhere down here. I don't know if I put it on the screen, but you don't have anything indicating that there's an issue here. So it's just in the text as it is. A couple other final things to point out. I'll mention in line B, you have this, but in tuta, in this, kalchasto ha kalchumenos. So in this, let the boasting one boast, namely to understand, to know the Lord, et cetera, et cetera. And then you have that bit with the geis there. Now, why is that interesting to me? Well, if you look down here in the apparatus, you have the in tuta. It's referring back to this. And there's a variant in domino, in the Lord. And this happens to be the Coptic tradition here. Now, why is that significant? Well, if you look up the version in Paul in 1 Corinthians 1:31, he says this, ha kalchumenos. So we have the ha kalchumenos there. Then you have the kalkasto, fair enough. But instead of in tuta, he has in Kyrio, in the Lord. And so maybe there's a version out there. Notice it doesn't exactly match this, nor does it match Jeremiah, because in Jeremiah and in this, you just have the in this. But in the Coptic here, you do have at least some evidence that maybe a version of this song did have in the Lord as opposed to in this. Now, the Coptic is a bit later than Paul, but maybe it has an earlier tradition. So who knows? Maybe Paul isn't making a change here himself, or maybe he had a slightly different version of whatever this is that already had in the Lord. He just used that as opposed to the in tuta that we see here in the Greek of Hannah's song. Don't know, but pretty interesting thing that we see there in the apparatus. So there's a lot more we could talk about, a lot more other variants, but hopefully this has been enough to whet your appetite for some of the interesting stuff in these Cambridge editions. Highly commend them. They are freely available online, and especially in the places where we don't see any books yet from the Göttingen edition. This is still a very, very good source. It may not be fully up to date, of course, in terms of recent papyri and so forth that have been discovered, but it's still a very, very good place to get data if you're studying the Old Greek. So for now, we'll leave the larger Cambridge Septuagint there on King's Parade. We probably will come back to it down the road, but thanks for paying attention, tuning in. See you next time.